Hello, and welcome once again to the accidentally named Free Thought Blog's Podish-Sortacast, where people who are used to writing instead try to talk live on camera. This month, we're talking about propaganda, from the big, heavy wartime messages everyone thinks about when they hear the word, down to the insidious, smaller messages that sway public opinion to support one political ideology by demonizing another. Today, we have H.J. Hornbeck from Reprobate Spreadsheet, Christian Wager from ProScience, the Great American Satan from their eponymous blog, Dr. Sarah from Geeky Humanist, William Brinkman from the Bolingbroke Babbler, and I'm Abby St. Brendan from Impossible Me. As I understand it, HJ said he'd like to lead us in with a few definitions, which are always a useful thing to have when you're trying to talk about something.
Quite, yes. And hopefully I can open this up to everybody as well to comment on. Obviously we want some sort of definition for what propaganda is, otherwise we just start calling everything propaganda or nothing propaganda. So I think a good way to think about it is in terms of three key things that have to be part of something for it to be considered propaganda. One is that it's a distraction from something. You're not supposed to be thinking of one thing, you're supposed to be thinking of another. A second thing would be that it's based on half-truths or, partial truths, but a fair chunk of it is just straight up false. And a third thing is a very key emotional content to it. The key one I can think of would be the denazification claim when it comes to Ukraine. I mean, think about it for a second. Imagine, in fact, that line is 100% true. Every single, person within the Ukrainian government is a straight-up neo-Nazi. They're goose-stepping around everywhere, raising the flags and all that. Is the appropriate thing to do invade Ukraine, given the context that they have not actually invaded any other countries? Who knows what's happening internally, but no invasions are going on. Definitely not, right? I mean, this should be our key focus, this is an invasion with no real justification for it. But the hope instead is that by claiming that, these are denazifications, rather than sort of talking about that, you'll be talking about whether or not Ukraine is ruled by Nazis, and not whether or not the invasion should have gone forward. That's sort of the distraction component to it. Second of all, there is actually a grain of truth to it. There is the Azov battalion within Ukraine, which is a straight-up neo-Nazi group. There have been, images shared on social media and all that from people with, Nazi slogans on their, clothing and such, sort of showing off that, hey, they actually align with this. There are neo-Nazis within Ukraine, and they are fighting on the Ukrainian side. That is not the same as they're in charge of Ukraine. But that's not really the point. We're now supposed to be arguing over what level of Nazification is appropriate for that, instead of the proper aims on there. So again, grain of truth, the entire thing seems to be mostly false. But the third thing is also the emotional component, because if you actually start to argue, well, it's not like the Nazis actually have control of Ukraine or anything like that. The propagandists can actually point back to those few exceptions like the Azov battalion and say, aha, you're siding with Nazis, you're wrong. And the whole goal of that is to essentially shut down rational thought and get you focused on the emotional thing and all that. Generally speaking, once our emotions sort of kick into high gear, we're very bad at rational thought and those sorts of things. And we tend to get into more flight or fright kind of responses and all that. And that's exactly what the propagandist is hoping to do, is to trigger that sort of thing. So you won't actually sit back and critically contend with what they're arguing. And that you're going to make more, rash decisions based on that. It's sort of sharpening into, hatred against Russians, which sort of justified, but also sort of not in some sense. But anyway, those are my 3 points for what actually defines propaganda itself.
I mean, that immediately makes me ask a question, does something have to be untrue or at least significant percentage untrue to be propaganda? Can it in fact be anything?
I mean, you could argue that a lot of the images we're seeing out of Ukraine are propaganda, even if they are ultimately true. This sort of siege of Mariupol, where there's an ongoing humanitarian disaster. This is a horrific event. And sharing images of this, horrific event is actually galvanizing people to that side. There's a strong emotional component, and the thing is, though, it sort of fails on the other two axes with that. That's why I sort of set and defined propaganda in that way. You can simply have it to be something with an emotional content or something that's false. But what happens when you start dealing with sort of secondary things and all that? Say, somebody saying that, carrots help promote clear vision, for instance. That was actually some World War II propaganda started by the British. And if you're sharing it back at the time, yeah, that's indeed straight up propaganda. But what about now? Most people don't even realize its roots in British propaganda during the war. Should we still be labeling it as propaganda? I'm not so sure.
Get to that point.
Sorry.
Oh, no. Go ahead.
Go ahead, Brinkman. You're up.
Sure.
Okay. Let's go with Brinkman for the moment because there's a little bit of a collision there.
Okay. No, I was just going to say that when regarding the carrots, at this point, several years later, it's now more urban legend than propaganda. Is my opinion.
I like that we've managed to immediately talk about the roots of the carrot question.
Yeah.
What was that you were going to say, Satan?
Well, now my mouth's full of food, but
It's those carrots again. Got to watch out for
there's a
their
good
war
example of propaganda coming from us. The free thought blogs at some point in the past had somebody that I think even more than one blogger that decided to make the evils of Islamic fundamentalism their beat, if you will. So that every single day they would have information about something evil being done under the banner of Islam, under the name of Islam. So they could all be true facts. They certainly were evils that are being perpetrated in the name of Islam. But if you see that, nothing but that every single day, and not see like the grand world of people that are Muslims that are just regular people living their day-to-day life doing good things or at least okay, neutral things, right? Then it definitely becomes propaganda, like the Black Crime Watch on Breitbart. So we've had some role in spreading Islamophobia, like collectively on our own site, and that was I'd say that while completely true, propaganda as well.
Yeah, well, that's actually kind of what I was thinking of, or at least an example of it, when I decided to push very gently back on the claim that propaganda has to contain untruth. Because one classic, definitely an example of propaganda, which has long history, is demonizing a group by selecting particular bad actors in that group and going, aha, look, this is what they do. So hence the example there, black crime. Are those crimes real? Were they actually committed by Black people? Probably. Are they a reasonable way to look at the entire group? Obviously not, but that's what they're pushing for.
But there's many ways of looking at truth. I mean, lying by omission is also lying. So I think you could work it, but I also prefer to say that propaganda is one-sided rather than it's untruthful. I mean, I think lying by omission is a kind of lie, but it's a little bit harder to to point out as so.
It's kind of difficult, isn't it? It might be an unfair question, actually, because yes, what is the exact definition of truth? But it's more a matter of, I think, context, trying to put things in there. I just want to mention that that whole Breitbart's black crime thing, these are the things that have been done in the name of Islamic fundamentalism. This is also a classic back in the day Nazi technique. They used to publish lists of Jewish crimes, and nowadays TERFs do the same thing. So it's a very popular and time-tested form of propaganda.
Yes.
So it's also about telling the truth in a way that's misleading.
Exactly.
And I see we've had a comment querying, is propaganda one of those terms that it's become a very negative thing, but that could be used more neutrally? Let me just check that I've correctly quoted that. It says, Hemi Scott says, is propaganda a term like ideology that has taken on a negative connotation but could be a more neutral term? And I mean, my thought on that, for what it's worth, would be no. I think that at this point, it's so strongly associated with being a negative word. I don't think it could be effectively reclaimed as a neutral term. I think it's too strongly associated with negative connotations. What other people think?
And I don't think in my lifetime it's ever been a neutral. I think in my lifetime it's always been negative, and I mean, getting close to 50. So I mean,
the term I think has always involved a certain stretching of the truth at a minimum, even if it's not necessarily outright lies. So I would agree. I don't think it ever meant something good.
Yeah, it's saying things in support of a particular cause, and there is this implication of a strong bias there, a strong deliberate bias there.
Yeah. I think there's a difference between persuasion and arguably marketing, which is like one-sided, but then you've got propaganda, which takes into the distortion to a whole new level. So I don't think it'll ever be a positive term. Maybe never was.
Well, no, that's interesting. Is it? Where exactly would we say the line is between marketing and propaganda? Is it really only whether what you're trying to sell is political?
I disagree. I don't think selling is the right word when we were talking about trying to convince people to join a side, which is what propaganda is. I mean, then you're selling it broader the terms, and then it comes meaning is marketing is aimed at selling a specific product or company, while propaganda is aimed at uniting people either for something or against something. That would be for me be a very big distinction.
I don't know. Is that an actual distinction? Marketing seems to be intended to get as many people as possible united under handing over some money for these things. They're both intended to try to get people to commit resources to some cause. It's just in one case the cause is profits, in the other case the cause is possibly killing people you don't like.
I think that's basically it. Marketing is commercial. Propaganda is about ideas and movements and beliefs.
True. There is, of course, overlap. Consider for a moment the marketing of Harley Davidson, for example. And if there's any Harley lovers watching this, no, I'm not trying to say the company is inherently horrible or whatever. I don't actually know. Maybe they are, but it's more the point that the marketing for Harley is a really good example of trying to sell an emotion and a feeling rather than specifically a product, because they put out a lot of stuff showing like the freedom of the open road and all this thing, and it's all like specifically intended to basically appeal to dads who haven't felt that sort of thing in a while, if ever. So it's all very nebulous and almost connected to the rugged individualist ideology that runs through a lot of Western, especially American media. So
there is an extremely strong association between political imaging and advertising in the United States, especially when it comes to supposedly manly products. Anything associated with the outdoor lifestyle or industry or trucks, motorcycles, you name it.
This is one reason why I like sort of adding the distraction kind of proviso to that. Harley Davidson isn't trying to distract you from their motorcycles. If anything, they're trying to grab your attention and direct it that way. Versus propaganda, it generally tries to get you away from the real discussions and all that. Other good examples, are sort of the whole turfy, woman is an adult human female thing. Well, what exactly is a female? Does it really have the solid definition that so many TERFs claim it has? Or TERFs and transphobes, I should say. It's an attempt to distract and to go away from the main thing, which you can't really say about advertising per se.
Can you not? It's interesting. So what about the ads that certain large corporations put out with their feel-good content and associating themselves with, pleasant mornings and waking up to good coffee or whatever, to distract from where does that coffee come from? What kind of people are harvesting that coffee? What kinds of international abuses have been? Now, I'm only picking on coffee because it came to mind, but in general, big companies don't like it when they're being looked at too closely.
Yeah, well, I agree with that, actually. I think there's a recent case with M&M's. Do you remember the big whole hullabaloo about, we're changing M&M's and all that? that actually was an example of propaganda because it was trying to distract, I believe it was from allegations of child slavery with their harvesting of cocoa or something like that. I've forgotten the details,
Yeah.
unfortunately. But that actually is a case where advertising sort of veers into propaganda itself. We're supposed to be outraged or, debating what exactly these changes mean, and supposed to be sort of ignoring the child labor that was involved.
Absolutely. Now, here's an interesting question. Is what Tucker Carlson did deliberately being part of it or being snowed by it? Because the whole thing with that change with what M&M's did there was very sneaky because they didn't do that much of a marketing campaign on what they were doing. Instead, they sort of dropped it in front of the people who like to have culture war issues, who then went, oh my God, the green M&M isn't sexy anymore, which is just such an odd thing.
Yeah.
But it worked because then the whole argument wound up being about Tucker Carlson wants to screw the green M&M instead of M&Ms are buying child slave labor cocoa.
Yeah, and again, to bring up another example, the Meta rebrand of Facebook. That actually was timed coincidentally with a whistleblower leaking a whole ton of documents, sort of saying that, Facebook actually knew about a lot of this misinformation and all that, and was actually actively, promoting it, even though they, was allowing it to go, even though they could have stopped it. That's another prime example of the same thing, and I mean that again is I think an example of advertising turning into propaganda. So
Well, I think propaganda is a form of persuasion / marketing, only for more deceptive and distracting purposes.
Yeah, I think the examples you're talking about strike me as distraction more than propaganda. They're sort of the negative side of the coin, of which propaganda is the active side.
yeah, and to sort of circle back to the point which I just forgot because I wanted to rant about Meta a little bit. Shoot, now I've just completely derailed my train of thought for a second time. But
Your
yeah,
own
right.
propaganda is working very well on yourself.
Very well, yes. But yes, whether or not Tucker Carlson actually is actively engaging in it, well, that's one reason why I don't really have intent sort of within the definition of that, because it can be very hard to suss out. He obviously has very deep ties, and to Russian agents indirectly via the far right people that he hangs out with. Again, Russia has been. I should say the Kremlin actually has been actively engaging with these groups to try and get them on the side for years, decades, I think, at this point. Um, and it really doesn't matter in the long run whether or not he's doing it actively or, he really just honestly believes it. It's the same net effect. And oftentimes people who push propaganda will look for what's often termed the useful idiot. Someone who will just parrot their claims without necessarily thinking about it. And, carry on the frames and do like almost a form of meme washing in some sense. The idea being that you throw out your propaganda, but because it's coming from an official channel, like say, the Ministry of Defense for Russia and all that, it doesn't really have much impact. People expect, well, okay, the Russian government, of course, is going to be, have a very biased view of how Russia is doing within Ukraine. But when it starts to show up on TikTok, for instance, from people who are not obviously associated with the Ministry of Defense, that gets around that sort of, bias to be like, okay, well, I don't necessarily trust what's coming from there, but these TikTok people are a little bit different. You know, I can actually start to, I can start to give it a little bit more weight once it comes from that.
Or an older example, back in the 80s, the KGB started planting stories in the Indian press about HIV being genetically engineered, and then that kind of took off from there until we had an AIDS denialist movement in the United States in the late 80s and 90s.
Yeah, I think we actually were listening to the same podcast too, because one thing that was brought up on that was basically how these things sort of feed into themselves. One thing which was sort of debating throwing into the term of propaganda or not is repetition. It is absolutely critical to have some level of repetition there. There is a reason why TERFs and transphobes keep repeating, oh, we're worried about bathrooms, we're worried about sexual assault, we're worried about, these these medical experiments on, kids and all that. It is absolutely false what they're sort of claiming on there, but because they keep repeating it over and over and over again, it tends to give it a little bit more credibility, a little bit more weight, because we think, hey, if they're actually being honest, interlocutors on this, they would have actually looked at the evidence and realized, oh no, I'm pushing a falsehood. So the fact that they keep repeating it is a sign that it actually has some truth to it. And in addition to that, hearing the same thing from multiple sources tends to actually convince people that it's true, not realizing that all those multiple sources are actually getting it from the same original source. It's this one study published,
kind of a strange aspect of that.
Oh, go ahead, Satan.
Oh, sorry.
Sorry, we always bow to Satan here.
Okay. Funny thing about repetition there. That could work for other stuff too. There was this I saw this jokey video talking about how the record industry is able to push music that's just inherently crap just by merit of giving it the radio play. It's like the first time you hear it, you're like, oh god, that's awful. Second time you hear about it, and you're like, oh well, it's there. And then third time you're like, I could almost kind of see this. Somehow they could legitimize something just through repetition. Yeah, I think that was. Oh, and I had another thing in mind too, but I can skip it.
What? Right. No, why skip it? We're here to talk about this.
I can't even remember what it was.
That's okay.
But
Very easily lose train of thought here.
But one thing I find interesting about the whole, repetition is even when you repeat it to refute it, it will even strengthen it. That's what is being shown, that arguing against bad arguments are usually actually make them more efficient rather than debunking. That's one of the big problems with skepticism. I mean, you will convince some people, but unfortunately, some people who just following it on the sideline will get convinced there must be something to it, since you use all that energy in debunking it. So,
well, and it relates a lot to sort of the debates that creationists keep insisting on. Debates are a way to legitimize their discourse and say that it's on par with people who have solid science in their corner. It's not really an extent to sort of get to the truth. It's just an excuse to repeat their talking points over and over again.
Another aspect of repetition is that it wears people down over time, because you keep arguing it, and they keep repeating it, and then it creates a cognitive dissonance, and then it just wears you down.
Especially if you are what's being argued about.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Agreed.
So here's an interesting aspect of certain kinds of propaganda that we haven't mentioned so far. The idea of never listening to your opponent. And the classic "the art of war" type of thing is know your enemy, which always struck me as a very reasonable and sensible thing to do. I always figured you have to know what they're thinking, you have to know what they're going to do. Whereas very large quantities of propaganda of a political, but especially ideological type, specifically carry a payload of no, this is what they're really thinking, and don't listen to them because they lie all the time, which it's always confused me a little bit. It seems like such a strategic error, but I suppose it works when your whole strategy is just convince everyone to hate those people and shoot them, I guess.
It works for the intellectual dark web. That's the modus operandi, is telling what the rogue people are actually thinking rather than what they're thinking, or finding that one bit of information that you could use to boost whatever your claims are. It's really impressive, and that. But so yes, I think you need to be really efficient at propaganda. You need to understand your enemy, but you also need to make sure that nobody else understand them. So you need to kind of tell people what they're thinking in weirdly confusing and different ways, if that makes sense.
So you're saying that arguably part of the purpose of propaganda is to keep people ignorant of what their opponents are actually about.
Yeah, or at least misinformed. There's a weird situation we have where North Korea. We all know that North Korea makes them a lot of propaganda, but there's actually a lot of propaganda about North Korea that's spread in the West. That's apparently made by extreme right-wing Japanese websites. So every time you hear about the divine leader, whatever, killing his family members by some barbaric means, it's usually correct that he killed his family, but the barbaric means is usually the Japanese website telling a lie. So it's a really weird thing, but just to make him seem even more extreme, so he gets contained. They really have the idea that he makes sure that he gets no friends by making him seem like a lunatic, which is fairly easy in his case. But that's a really interesting case of propaganda we see, and which is spread in mainstream media because they're not really aware of this.
Well, it's a good example of bad information driving out the good. In the case, North Korea is probably the most extreme case that's available right now, where the pro-North Korea and the anti-North Korea factions both have really strong motivations to lie about North Korea. So it's practically impossible to learn anything genuine and absolutely this is really what's going on there. It's just okay. How do you find somebody neutral about North Korea?
Yep,
that's another aspect of modern propaganda is flooding like forums with alternative information or the alternative facts so that people get confused and don't know what's true anymore, and then their emotions take over. So I think Steve Bannon phrased it, flooding the zone with manure. I'll be friendly. But yeah, that's basically the whole basis. You like so much information, disinformation. It's why until recently Russia didn't really shut down forums. They just had their allies flood them with misinformation so nobody could tell what was true, and then they shut it off or choose what they want.
I would say this is like especially true in the conservative states in the US. This is like so true of those places. It's hard for us to even like get our heads around, coming from another part of the country, how much media, social media, every source of information that you can get through vast tracts of the Midwest United States is completely dominated by hateful horse shit, to where it's like, I got a day job where sometimes people try to inject politics into the phone calls that I'm having with them. And when they do, it's like they're coming from, they might as well be from another planet. They're all just thinking like, oh, well, you sound white, so we obviously all agree about the fact that the president is a lunatic and totally incompetent, and although Trump really won the election and all this other kind of stuff. It's really dispiriting.
Yeah, and I grew up in Missouri and Oklahoma, so I know that feeling. And I briefly lived in rural Illinois, and it was weird to have a newspaper that would, on their website, they would have NRA videos as if they're legitimate news sources and not propaganda. So yeah, it's very easy to have an alternate worldview, or find media that supports your worldview in the red states and red areas.
Yep, it all comes back to controlling the information. You control the information, you control what people think, and then you can actually control what they feel as well, too, and where their biases go. Again, why propaganda will have some level of, misinformation or mistruth behind it.
NRA is kind of an interesting case study. You could argue that entire organization lives on the line between marketing and propaganda, because nominally they're all about promoting the sales of guns. They're all about gun ownership and all of this. So it's theoretically a product, not a specific company, but a product, a category of product they're trying to promote. But they seem to promote a few other things in there.
I think they're pretty definitely about promoting a belief. I mean, they're promoting the belief that gun rights should not be in any way managed, controlled, reduced, whatever. So yeah, I would definitely see them as promoting a belief rather than trying to sell a product.
But they are very closely tied with the people that sell the products. They get a huge amount of money, of course, from arms manufacturers and such. And their advertisements are in Guns and Ammo magazine and all that.
Well, I mean, I suppose they could advertise in Modern Housekeeping, but that would be a unusual definition of decor, I suppose.
Although propaganda can have its weird, things like that. This is one thing with which QAnon and a lot of far right movements tend to do as well, is they look very carefully for potential allies they could have. So, for instance, QAnon was often sort of siding with the wellness industry and all that. They saw a lot of common ground and common interest in various conspiracy theories and stuff, and actually has tweaked the wellness industry to give it a much more far right lean than you would expect from just sort of what you would think of on that side. And you see this again and again with far right groups trying to sort of jump in and influence things, and via indirect action and all that, to try and push their propaganda out to the greater public.
Moving from the horseshoe theory to the horse shit theory.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And one thing that might be worth bringing up too is propaganda isn't always outward facing. I think someone brought up earlier the whole sort of thing that it's an emotional thing, but it's also for in-group cohesion too. One side effect of emotions, using emotional language to shut down rational thought, is it makes it tougher to reason your way out of it. I was spotting a nice documentary actually on somebody who infiltrated a bunch of transphobic and TERF groups under a false name. I forget the name of the video itself. Maybe it'll come to me later. But
sounds like Kalen Conrad's.
Kalen Conrad.
That was Carla Marinara, wasn't it? Was the character?
Yeah. It is a ridiculously named character.
Not Carla. Something like that, though. Yeah. Definitely Marinara. That sort of thing. That's a name that sticks in your head, much like the stain.
Yes. And within those groups themselves, oftentimes they would be forward-facing, they would have fairly flowery language about rights, and protecting rights and all that. Within the groups themselves, they would just chatter about the same things over and over again, repeating these same sort of talking points and doing a lot of fear-mongering amongst the groups themselves. And this is to sort of keep them within the group and sort of focused on their prime hatred of transgender people. The same anecdotes would pop up. A lot of, bigotry was actually sort of accepted. This false name, for instance, they sort of introduced themselves to the group by talking about I think it was talking about their transgender son or daughter, I forget which. And at the same time slipped in a little bit of casual homophobia. This actually did get some ire from the group saying, hey, what's with this homophobic stuff? But it's telling that rather than kick out this person exhibiting a mild bit of homophobia or dress them down, the administrators there actually created an entirely new group and put this person in this group just because they wanted that ally. Even though this person was problematic, a homophobe and all that, they were a transphobe, and that's all that really mattered to transphobes. So oftentimes you'll find the sort of cohesion on that, but also an attempt to spread this propaganda as far and wide as you can into areas which you wouldn't necessarily think of.
Well, that's interesting. So what would you all say if I were to suggest that the ultimate end state of successful propaganda is always a cult?
Depends on the definition of a cult.
Yes, but everything depends on the definition by definition. So work with me here.
I would say I just phrase it as the ultimate end state is an audience that believes you unquestionably, or even if they consider themselves independent thinkers, but then spew your points. That's the end point. Total control of information.
Well, yeah.
Yeah, and a cult would fit into that, but there's also totalitarian leaders would also fit into that. So I mean, so I think propaganda in many cases would end in a cult, but also in some cases just end in totalitarian leader. And if you call that a cult, yeah, well then yes. But I think there's a distinction there at least.
No,
Or
that
maybe,
sounds about right.
Yeah, or maybe the ultimate goal of propaganda is to turn the Overton window from a window to a slit.
The party told you to reject the evidence of your eyes and ears. It was their final, most essential command. The one quote from the book that so many people seem to claim to have read but haven't, I've actually read it, just for the record.
Me too.
Me 3.
Everyone have read it.
I think we all have read it here.
Here, probably.
It's not that long a book.
No, it's really not. But arguably, that line itself is an example of what actually would be the difference between a totalitarian political organization that uses information control and a cult that uses information control. Is it really just the identity of the leader? I mean, I don't know, because look at Big Brother in the book, look at Trump in the real world. It's like they always go, no, it's that guy that we care about. Not anything he's actually saying or doing, just it's the guy.
I think a meaningful distinction between a cult and a totalitarian leader is that the totalitarian leader has a degree of state force behind him that a cult usually don't have. So in that sense, that's probably a difference. Trump could command people who didn't believe in him.
Well,
and he also apparently.
Sorry, go ahead.
No, I said, and apparently he could also command that other people believed in it. That was something that we saw that on January 6th, but that was, yeah.
Well, and it's worth sort of thinking about leaderless movements too. You know, a lot of these far-right communities don't really sort of have a proper leader per se. It was kind of telling, actually, when Trump came out in favor of vaccines a little while ago. It's not that, you know, the sort of anti-vax portion sort of crumbled and all that. They more or less sort of said, well, no, he's just saying this because or some other reason. It didn't really shake their foundations. And you find this a lot within, you know, the far right. You can actually sort of get yourself into these sort of propaganda bubbles where you're sort of following along with the groupthink and you know, not looking outside of it, but without necessarily at the urging of one individual leader. You know, I think this is a kind of a valuable frame to think about it when it comes to transphobic groups too, since there really isn't any, you know, proper transphobic thought leaders short of, say, Jordan Peterson or something like that. And many of these people wouldn't even take him as being, you know, the canonical leader after all.
They're talking about I've seen analysis of social media in the past that said that it's like there's like a certain sort of nexus people that have that are the big influencers, like whether that was their aim or not, but there's like most people are just sort of like around. They're like more passive or like not posting as much, just but they are like maybe they reblog from people or whatever. But in terms of tracking engagement, there'd be like certain people that would be like the centers of like cells within social media. And I think that the transphobia in a sense has that decentralized thought leadership, much like terrorism's, where like, you know, the Al-Qaeda or whatever, where it's like you'd have these little like social media people that they're not like reaching like millions, but they're like they're at least reaching thousands. And there'd be some people who'd just be known by NIMS and whatnot out there that are been like really influential in the movement and spreading propaganda within it.
This is pretty interesting that QAnon and related things have evolved into a sort of headless cultness. I'm not sure how often I've seen a process like that before. I genuinely don't know. Do any of you have other examples of this sort of thing happening in ways that might predate the social media glut?
Most of my examples I can think of might be tied to, say, the far right. There's the idea of sort of the lone wolf shooter, which has been around, I think, for many decades within that circle. It's a way to sort of get plausible deniability and get people not sort of thinking about radicalization pipelines for the alt right or the far right for what has it. I forget exactly the origins of it, but it was in some influential novel, which is read quite widely within there, sort of actually advocating don't have leader movements because because then everything sort of ties into the leader itself. Once that leader falls or changes their mind or something like that, you're toast. So
The
instead,
only
sort of
specifically hard right novel I'm aware of is the Turner Diaries. Is that the one you're thinking of? Does that have that?
that might be it. It's
Yeah,
been
I
a
think
little
so.
while.
I think that's true.
Okay. All right, that might be the one I'm thinking of. But of course, the advantage of a leader of this thing is there is no leader that you can sort of capture or turn or anything like that. It allows the idea to self-perpetuate. Of course, the disadvantage is there's sort of no real direction for where this thing goes. I mean, you can see all the twists and turns within QAnon itself. How it was supposed to be how Trump was going to, avenge, take over all the pedophiles that are present within, the liberal media, the Democrats and all that. And it's still, QAnon is still going, even though there is no Trump to actually take things over. The beliefs have just sort of mutated and warped. It's
I'm
not.
I think of something that this drive. Sorry.
No.
This makes me think of is the rise of Christianity, and it's like really really hard to know historical specifics on that. But it's very easy from what I've seen to imagine that when Christianity rose, it was like this like little cells of people spreading out from where the point of origin, presuming those events historically actually did happen, and just spreading this idea of the Son of God like dying for sins, yada yada, and it had like some pretty radical things that happened just before Christianity reached the point where it developed a canon and like big centralized power sources. But there would be like there was a period in history when the suicide for Jesus was like really popular. People would like throw themselves off of cliffs and stuff like that just as a demonstration of their faith. And somebody had to come back and like, canonize that this was like, no, that's actually totally against the rules in order to keep it from happening. I get a mental image of the origin of Christianity as being something like that, which makes me think, what would QAnon Christianity look like in 200 years?
Scary thought.
QAnon tend to think they're Christians now, despite the fact that they are definitely arguing mostly for things that, let's say that their Jesus is non-canonical, according to the source material. So that's
a bit wide at least.
So let's spend the last little while then talking about whether there are effective ways of counteracting propaganda. And I'm going to throw in there as well, tear apart like bulldogs if that is your wish, that I'm inclined to think that there is no choice in counteracting propaganda except other propaganda.
I disagree slightly with that. One of my sort of central touchstones for this actually comes from fiction, believe it or not. American Gods by Neil Gaiman has a fairly strong plotline. I don't want to give away too much, so I'll try and be a little circumspect. Where a big catastrophe is sort of averted just simply by somebody sitting down and talking about the situation to everybody. Actually getting proper lines of communication, getting things sort of talking and moving is what actually ultimately solves a specific plot point. And you see echoes of this in real life too. There is a person who got famous for actually deconverting people from the KKK and all that. This black man who his technique was to actually just go in and talk with these people. Do what's sometimes called like empathetic listening or something like that. Actually just sit down and talk with them one-on-one, see what their thoughts are on these things, maybe give some mild pushback and all that, and just try and drop little trivial bits of food for thought. And over time,
Right.
I mean, the numbers actually speak for themselves.
Do they though? Because here's the thing, you have to get people to listen first.
Yes.
And as I mentioned earlier, a major component of a lot of the propaganda / cult ideologies that go around now is don't listen to those people because they're not trustworthy. I mean, in some cases it gets quite extreme. Referring to the TERFs again for a moment, there is this inclination to, even if they don't buy into the claim that all trans people are deluded or predatory, they still say they're all mentally ill and can therefore not be trusted, and therefore you have to listen to doctors who are cis and have no experience of it, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Like that's the minimum there. So, but it's all different kinds of don't listen. How do you get past that?
I think there's two. I think it's important to consider there's two levels of countering propaganda. There's one way of stopping the spread, and we saw actually an efficient way of doing that in Ukraine, where they went down and said there's going to be a lot of propaganda coming out. Be aware of it. I mean, it's basically making people aware that there's a campaign going on. This was a very clear example because we've seen the effect before, so we kind of could everybody believe this. I mean, it might be harder if it's a completely new one. The other one is rolling back the effects of propaganda. That's a really much harder one, and that might be a case where we need to our propaganda on our own side. But I think it's important to remember there's kind of two distinct levels of countering propaganda.
Yeah, my upcoming novel kind of deals with that. I would say maybe you can't really get to the hardcore people, but you try to keep information open for the people who are persuadable or are still trying to form their opinion. And that's a way to counteract it, is just to have information out there, prevent people from being closed off. But it's not easy, and it's a tool.
One thing suggest that. Go on, HJ.
Oh, sorry. One other approach to it is essentially sort of taking advantage of our tendency to weigh peer groups a bit differently. So, like there's Christian Piglucci and a number of, hopefully I got the name right, a number of former people from the alt-right who actually, did the hard work of, sort of pulling themselves out of this information bubble and coming back, sort of realizing just all the lies that are behind it. What you can actually do is find people like these and sort of promote their voices and be like, hey, here's somebody who believed in X, but now no longer does. There's a TERF who became a former TERF who became famous, a year or two ago for sort of coming out and arguing that the entire thing was a cult. This is before Caleb's video and all that. It was somebody else. Kalen, thank you. And that I think is a very powerful technique. If you can find those people and promote their voices, it's a way to sort of help sort of pierce that armor of no, everything is wrong. But ultimately, there is no easy way around it. You can sort of look to the three pillars I sort of defined before. If a key component to propaganda is emotions to sort of close off rational thought, then try and find ways to diffuse, the emotional side and focus more on the rational side of things. If it's, promoting misinformation about something based on a small grain of truth, well, just flood the zone with truth as much as you can. Try and, share, this is what's actually happening on the ground and all that.
Flooding the zone with truth is always a bit of a difficult prospect. Well, I can get around the world before the truth has got its boots on.
Agreed.
But I would suggest
there's also controlling the zone, like you or being able to even speak in the zone that's where the propaganda is being spread.
Hence the don't listen to them thing. So I would suggest that the longest term strategy, which we are in no position to successfully implement right now, would be as much as possible the teaching of critical thinking.
I disagree. I think that's actually like I mean theoretically it would be good. Right? Like the whole skeptical movement and atheist movements are founded on the idea that critical thinking skills and applying the rational reason would help us get over our prejudices and make the world a better place. And it makes a lot of intuitive sense in demonstrated at all.
I mean, no. I'm gonna jump in there. You took what I just said and ran in a direction that I was not saying. I didn't say anything about, and this is the way to make the world a better place. I said this is the way to make people resistant to propaganda. And bear in mind, there's a huge difference between actually engaging in critical thinking and mistaking your own prejudices for rationality because you've taken rationality on as an identity. A lot of the guys that are being, as you say, the examples of this not working, they're not being critical thinkers because they're not turning the lens of critical thinking on themselves. They're just picking the version of things that made the most sense to them and going, well, I believe it and I'm rational, therefore this is rational. Like this, no. This is not the same thing at all.
It does bear point to an issue with language for me. Like, how do you get somebody, because we don't have telepathy, we don't have direct mind-to-mind communication, we have the barrier of language and understanding between us. Like, how do you get somebody to act to where they're actually doing the critical thinking, or just thinking they're doing the critical thinking, going like, oh yeah, I think I get this, and then like kind of going off on their own direction with it, and like ending up down those holes where it's not working for them anymore anyways.
Well, the whole point is why. It's teaching them to say, why, okay, they're saying this thing, why are they saying that thing, why do I think that thing? And that's like a really important part that tends to get left out there. It's interrogating.
I'd agree with that.
Why do you believe something?
Yeah, absolutely.
And that's like the major missing component. And that's the thing that the skeptic bros don't do. They don't look at themselves and go, why do I believe this? Does it actually match up with what reality is saying, or is it something else that's gotten in there?
I guess my main thing would be that it's just, I find it, I see the failure of people that they got the words down, but they just they really, that particular blind spot that you're mentioning, that's been thrown in my face so many times. I just see these people over and over again failing to do that one basic bit of skepticism.
Right,
and
which is essentially the point, because critical thinking is a skill. It's something that has to be taught and practiced like any other artisanal skill, which leads me to one more question. Do you think this is why so many propaganda mills right now are demonizing anything with the word critical in it, in order to prevent it from being taught to kids?
Oh yeah, no question.
To some extent, but I think people who consider themselves independent thinkers are susceptible to propaganda. It's like, oh, the mainstream media is saying this, but this is alternative, and I'm an independent thinker, so I may even listen to this. So I don't think it's necessarily the word critical, but just lost my train of thought.
You mentioned trying to teach this. I imagine you're talking about teaching it to the youths, and that this could have potentially a long-term payoff of down the road to where people would be able to recognize. Whereas if somebody says, I see something independent, I'm independent, therefore whatever, that's more of an identity-based thing rather than a thought-based thing, right?
Yeah, I think that's an important part. Being independent is not necessarily virtue in itself. I mean, you don't want an independent AIDS researcher, right? You want someone who actually understands the science, right? So independent is not, but being critical thinker. I mean, anybody who thinks himself being a critical thinker should stop up and say, what major thing have I changed that I believed in over time because of the evidence? And if you can't find anything, you might have to rethink yourself whether you really are that critical thinker, or otherwise you're really good at being perfectly right the first time.
I suppose. I mean, something that tends to get glossed over a lot is that skepticism, critical thinking, it's not denialism. It's you examine why, and then you continue to believe that thing if the evidence is good enough.
Exactly.
Agreed.
Point.
Okay, I'm going to split the baby. You're both right. I mean, I have seen no shortage of critical thinkers do silly things. As it was popped up in the chat, street epistemology would seem to be almost like a poster child against this, since the very core of it is actually sort of talking about what do you believe, why do you believe it, and all that. In theory, is a great antiseptic to any sort of irrational beliefs. And yet, a fair number of them, I don't know if it's all or even most, but a number of them, as far as I can tell, just completely buy into culture war bullshit, and we'll repeat this sort of worst sort of slander about social scientists and all sorts of things without even sort of sitting back to do any critical thinking on it. In some sense,
I think that comes back to the same thing, though. It's identity versus practice, and that's something that people are susceptible to in a lot of cases. Consider the Christians. What does their book say they're supposed to do? Like, the whole teachings of canonical Jesus is all about charity and kindness and self-sacrifice and all of this. And then you have mega churches and so many people who basically, I think people will look at a creed of some kind, be it religious or otherwise, such as street epistemology, and go, okay, that looks really good. I'll buy that. But then they don't follow the instructions on the tin. They just think that I bought this, I agree with this, therefore I'm this. It's like, no, there's work to be done too.
Well, that is literally what Christianity has been based on, that you're supposed to believe a certain thing and that gets you into heaven. I mean, I know not all Christians would buy into that version of it, but you're talking a major chunk of Christianity who believe precisely that it's about just, following Jesus and believing that Jesus died for your sins, and that's it.
Jesus died for my sins, so I can go commit as many of them as I like. Well, that's not a great philosophy, but it is alive somewhere.
Well, no argument for you on that one, but yeah, I mean, the idea that belief that Jesus died for your sins is what makes you a Christian is, a very widespread one among Christians as their identifying feature, as I understand it. And to be fair, we're talking here about propaganda, and here I am as an atheist doing the exact thing we've been complaining about people doing and defining Christians and saying what they think. So, it is possible that I'm misrepresenting what they would say.
Well, no. To be fair, I don't think we're saying all Christians. We're saying there are definitely subsets of the group who do this thing.
But this is certainly how a subset of it comes across. Anyway, yes, I think in terms of how do you defeat propaganda, I think there is just no one simple answer or one true way. And I think it's a case of you try whatever you've got, however you can. Sometimes it's going to be putting as much correct information out there as possible. Sometimes talking to people one-to-one, like the person, I think it was HJ mentioned, who's converting the KKK people. Sometimes that actually works. Sometimes you'll just be wasting your time and effort, and you're better off trying to put as much accurate information out there as possible for the people who are willing to listen to it. Sometimes you have to have discussions, sometimes you have to shut discussions down because they're just going to get hijacked by people wanting to use them for their own ends. There's a lot of individual stuff, but I'm in a country that shows how badly things can go wrong if you don't really actively try to counteract propaganda, because people assumed we didn't have to counter the pro-Brexit propaganda, and look where that got us. So I'd say consider us a warning. Yeah, speak out against propaganda, and it's feel even when it feels like fighting a losing battle, fight that losing battle. So that's all I've got to say.
Well, that was beautiful. I think on that note is where we're going to bail on this, because frankly, yeah, that's right. We've got to do the work, even if it seems futile, because what else can we even do? So that's the end of our Podish-Sortacast for this month. From HJ, Christian, Sarah, Brinkman, the Great American Satan, and me, thanks for joining us, and see you next time.